Bonhoeffer's warning unheeded. The moral collapse of white evangelicalism. Why the most devout white Americans are the most captured. I've been thinking a lot lately about frogs and soup pots. You know the old illustration, the one preachers have used for decades about the frog in the kettle. Drop a frog into boiling water, the story goes, and it will jump out immediately. But that same frog in lukewarm water, and raise the temper gradually, and it'll sit there, adjusting, accommodating until it's too croak late. The illustration isn't actually true, biologically speaking. Real frogs aren't that passive, but we are. Human beings, it turns out, are far more susceptible to incremental heat than amphibians. I've been revisiting some research on how ordinary German Christians, people like, the ones that love their families, serve their community, sing hymns on Sunday morning, became step by step complicit in the unimaginable horror. It is a part of the German church story I didn't know much about prior to all the research for our audio documentary on the life and resistance of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This has me asking myself an uncomfortable question. What if we're the frogs now? What if the water's been warming for nearly a decade, and we've been adjusting so gradually that we can no longer feel how hot it's become? Or perhaps more unsettling, what if the water started warming long before we realized we were in the kettle at all? I should say at the outset that I'm not writing as an outsider. Talking about evangelicalism, I grew up as a Baptist church planter's kid, and I loved it. From my oldest memories, the church was a community where I was convinced that God knew me completely and loved me. I was introduced to Jesus and his kingdom, what some of us learned to call his kingdom, and I wanted to be his disciple and walk in his way. I came to trust Jesus, love the Bible. I didn't know people went to bed without reading scripture and talking to Jesus. That practice has never really wavered. Even now, the faith I received in those pews and Sunday school rooms remains the most important thing in my life, which is precisely why what's happened to white evangelicalism feels less like a political disappointment and more like a betrayal. The mechanism we'd rather not name. There's a concept that historians use when studying how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. They call it sequential complicity. The idea is deceptively simple, yet profoundly unsettling. Here's how it worked in Nazi Germany. The regime implemented its radical agenda, not all at once, but in small, manageable increments. The persecution of Jews developed over several years, starting with civil disabilities like losing jobs, restrictions on movement, social ostracism, and only later culminating in the genocide. Because the horror unfolded gradually, many individuals found themselves locked into the system by the time its full nature became apparent. The key insight is this. Once a person takes an initial step of compliance, something as seemingly mundane as registering their ancestry or joining a professional organization that excluded Jews, they entered a new psychological situation. The pressure to continue was powerful, and disengagement became increasingly difficult. Each step didn't add to previous steps. Each step changed the person taking it. It created new psychological needs to justify what they'd already done, to protect their precious investment or avoid the social cost of reversal. The person who defended yesterday's compromise was no longer in a position to clearly evaluate today's demand. I want to suggest carefully but clearly that something similar has been happening in white American evangelicalism. And I want to suggest it not as a outsider throwing stones, but someone formed by this tradition, someone who owes it the most important things in my life, and someone who believes that naming this pattern honestly may be the only way to break it. But to understand where we are, we need to understand where we've been. The sequence did not start in 2016. The water started warming long before Donald Trump descended down that golden elevator. The long sequence. There's a story white evangelicals tell about their entry into politics. It goes like this. In 1973, the Supreme Court legalized abortion in Roe v. Wade. Evangelical Christians, motivated by their deep commitment to the sanctity of life, rose up to defend the unborn. The religious right were born out of this moral conviction. It's a clean story, a righteous story. It's also not quite true. The historical record tells a more complicated tale. Throughout the 19th century, American evangelicalism was frequently aligned with progressive social reform, the abolition of slavery, universal suffrage, the creation of public schools. Postmillennial theology encouraged believers to build a kingdom of righteousness on earth. Evangelicals were often on the leading edge of justice movements, but something shifted. By the early 20th century, a militant reaction against modernism and biological evolution led many evangelicals to view the world as a wrecked vessel that could only be saved through individual conversion, rather than social reform. After the public ridicule of the 1925 Scopes trial, evangelicals largely retreated from their broader culture and into self-contained subcultures of their own institutions. Think their own schools, their own radio stations, their own publishing companies. For decades, the one issue that maintained evangelical engagement with the public square was the specter of godless communism, viewed as a satanic threat to Christian civilization. Billy Graham emerged as a unifying figure, using his massive platform to link evangelical concern with national identity and anti-communist patriotism. But here's what's often left out of the story. During this same period, most white evangelicals remained opposed to the civil rights movement. Many used what they called the spirituality of the church doctrine to avoid addressing racial justice, arguing the church's business was saving souls, not reforming society. The same theological move that had justified retreat from social engagement now justified silence in the face of segregation. This matters because it establishes a pattern. Long before Trump, white evangelicals had developed a theology that allowed them to separate their private piety from public injustice. The two spheres thinking that would later enable accommodation to authoritarianism was already being practiced. And then came that real catalyst, the event that actually sparked the religious right as we know it. It wasn't Roe v. Wade. In the mid-1970s, the federal government began challenging the tax-exempt status of private Christian schools that practiced racial segregation, most notably Bob Jones University. The conservative activist Paul Weyrich recognized an opportunity. He successfully mobilized evangelical leaders by characterizing the IRS actions as a secular assault on religious institutions. Here was a threat that could unite a movement. The government was coming after Christian schools. There was just one problem. Defending segregation wasn't a winning message for building a broad coalition. The movement needed a more respectable rallying point. Opposition to abortion was discovered as a political tool only in the late 1970s, years after Roe, to serve precisely for this purpose. The evangelical rank and file who had shown little interest in abortion as a political issue in the immediate aftermath of the Supreme Court decision were gradually taught to see it as the defining moral issue of the age. I don't say this to diminish the sincerity of pro-life conviction among many evangelicals today. I say this because the history matters. The religious right was not born from pure moral conviction about the unborn. It was born from a complex mixture of racial resentment, anti-government grievance, and shrewd political organizing, with abortion retrofitted as the public face of the movement. This was an early step into the kettle, and it made later steps possible. The Reagan rehearsal. The 1980 election provided a dress rehearsal for what would happen in 2016. The incumbent president was Jimmy Carter, a born-again Southern Baptist who taught Sunday school, spoke openly about his faith, and embodied a personal morality that evangelicals claim to value. He even divested of his peanut farm before taking office. How old school. Anyway, his challenger was Ronald Reagan, a divorced Hollywood actor who signed one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country as governor of California, who rarely attended church, and whose personal life bore little resemblance to evangelical ideals. By any measure of the character counts ethic, Carter should have been the obvious choice. Instead, white evangelicals abandoned the fellow believer for the movie star. At the 1980 National Affairs briefing in Dallas, Reagan signaled his total alignment with the religious right's political agenda. "I know you can endorse me," he told the assembled pastors, "but I want you to know that I endorse you." The political transaction was explicit. Personal character mattered less than political unity. Reagan won white evangelical voters decisively. And in the years that followed, evangelicals adopted what might be called selective literalism, focusing intensely on external sins like abortion, homosexuality, while quietly de-emphasizing biblical injunctions against divorce, the accumulation of wealth, and the treatment of immigrants and the poor. The ethical framework was already being selectively applied. The seeds of the 42 points shift towards the Republican Party that PRRI would later document was planted right here in the choice to prioritize political power over consistent moral witness. The purge. One more development from this era deserves attention because it established the template for how evangelical institutions would handle dissent. In 1979, the same year the Moral Majority was founded, conservatives executed a systematic takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in America and one that I grew up in. Over the following decade, moderates were purged from leadership positions, seminary faculties were reshaped, and the denomination was remade in the image of the religious right. The takeover was methodical and effective. Those who resisted were marginalized, pushed out, or simply worn down. By the time it was complete, the SBC had been transformed from a denomination with genuine theological and political diversity into something far more monolithic. This matters because it shows that the exile of dissenters we've witnessed in recent years, think Russell Moore forced out of the SBC, Beth Moore, David French, yeah, we'll come back to it. But this type of purification is not new. It's a repeated pattern. The movement's long known how to identify and then remove those who threaten the consensus, the sorting and purifying of communities until dissent becomes unthinkable. White evangelicals have been practicing that for over 40 years. The shift we can actually measure, which brings us back to the present and to the data that reveals just how far the journey's gone. We don't have to speculate about whether evangelical ethics shifted to accommodate Donald Trump. We can measure it. The Public Religion Research Institute has been tracking American attitudes about the relationship between personal morality and public leadership since 2011. That year, they asked a simple question. Do you think an elected official who commits an immoral act in their personal life can still behave ethically and fulfill their duties in public and professional life? In 2011, only 30% of white evangelicals agreed with that statement. This made sense, at least on the surface. For decades, evangelicals insisted that character counts, that personal morality is inseparable from public leadership. During the Clinton years, this conviction was thundered from pulpits and plastered on voter guides. I couldn't avoid it either. White evangelicals were, in fact, the least likely religious group in America to separate private morality from public fitness for office. less likely even than the religious unaffiliated. Then came 2016. By October of that year, just weeks after that Access Hollywood tape surfaced in which Donald Trump bragged about sexual assault, PRRI asked the same question again. This time, surprise, surprise, this time 72% of white evangelicals agreed that personal immorality was, in fact, compatible with ethical public leadership. In the span of 5 years, white evangelicals had gone from being the least likely to the most likely religious group to hold this view. A 42-point reversal. That represents the most dramatic ethical shift of any religious group in modern polling history. Deep breath. Wow. Let that sink in. The community that had built its political identity on values, voting, and moral character had, in a half-decade, completely reorganized its ethical framework. And the timing wasn't coincidental. The shift tracked precisely with the need to accommodate a political commitment already made. And as my grandma would say, a prior commitment is a higher one. But here's what the longer history reveals. This was not a sudden break. It was an acceleration. The willingness to overlook Reagan's divorce, to focus on some sins, ignoring others, purging dissenters, and enforcing conformity, all of it had laid the groundwork. The ethical flexibility had been developing for decades. Trump simply revealed how far it could stretch. How we got into the kettle. Let me take you back to 2016 for a moment. Remember the mood in evangelical circles when Donald Trump emerged as a Republican nominee? For many leaders, it was uncomfortable. He was a man who had been married 3 times, who bragged about sexual assault, who built casinos and appeared on the cover of Playboy, who seemed unable to name a single Bible verse that had shaped his life. He couldn't even think of one thing he's done that he might need forgiveness for. And that's the tame version of this man. The evangelical response to it was not enthusiasm, it was damage control. Leaders who spent decades insisting character counts now face a choice. And the choice they made, the choice many of us made or watched friends and family make, was to frame the election as a binary choice. Trump was indeed flawed, but yes, the alternative was worse. We weren't electing a pastor. The Supreme Court hung in the balance. Religious liberty was at stake. Now, there was some truth in these concerns. Was there some truth in these concerns? Of course. Many people had legitimate worries about abortion policy and judicial philosophy. But here's what I want us to notice. The initial framing, we're holding our noses, but the stakes are too high, was one more step into the kettle. It was a moment of compliance that would create a new psychological situation. It was also, in a sense, familiar. Evangelicals had made this move before. They had already chosen Reagan over Carter, trading character for political alignment. The muscle memory was already there. Because here's what happens when you publicly endorse someone. You stake your credibility on the outcome. You now have something to protect. You've invested social capital that you can't easily recover. Trump received 78% of the white evangelical vote in 2016. That is a landslide by any measure. But notice, it was framed, at least by many, as a reluctant, nose-holding, transactional choice. The character concerns were acknowledged, even if they ultimately set them aside. And so when that Access Hollywood tape surfaced, the grab them by the leaders who had already endorsed couldn't say, yeah, we were wrong. This is disqualifying. They had too much invested. Instead, they found new language. Locker room talk. Oh, he's changed. God uses flawed vessels. He's a baby Christian. The water had warmed by a few degrees, and we adjusted. The escalation. What happened next followed a pattern that would have been instantly recognizable to anyone who studied how complicity works in authoritarian contexts. After 2016, when the Gorsuch nomination validated the Supreme Court justification, it became even harder to question the bargain. You see, it worked. We got what we needed. The compromise paid off. Roe v. Wade has an expiration date. By 2020, Trump's share of the white evangelical vote climbed to 81%. That reluctant nose-holding support of 2016 had become something more consolidated, more confident. No more nose-holding needed. The justifications became celebrations. But then came new tests. Charlottesville, where the president was morally blind after a white supremacist murdered a counter-protester. Family separations at the border, where children were taken from their parents as a deliberate policy of deterrence. The first impeachment, the response to the pandemic. At each point, the choice was the same. Speak out and risk everything you've already invested, or find a way to accommodate, explain, minimize, and deflect. Most chose accommodation, not because they're evil people, not because they don't have genuine moral concerns, but because they were in a new psychological situation where the disengagement had become progressively more and more costly. Then came 2024. By now, Trump had been twice impeached, incited an insurrection at the Capitol, had spent 4 years spreading lies about election fraud, and had been convicted of 34 felony counts. By any measure of the character counts ethic that evangelicals had championed for decades, this should have been disqualifying many times over, but instead, evangelical support reached its highest level ever, 83%. Among white evangelicals who attended church multiple times per week, the most devout, the most committed, support hit 90%. The trajectory tells a story. 78%, then 81%, then 83%. Each cycle, the support didn't waver or decline as violations of character accumulated in the man. It increased. The lock-in was working exactly as the sequential complicity model would predict. The devout are not the exception. At this point, we need to address an objection that's become a kind of comfort blanket for those who want to believe the evangelical church itself is not the problem. The argument goes like this. The evangelicals supporting Trump aren't the real churchgoers. They're cultural Christians, nominal believers, people who check the evangelical box on surveys but rarely darken the door of a sanctuary. The faithful core, the people in the pews every Sunday, they're different. It's a comforting story, one I've received from very honest ministers in emails regularly. But it would mean that the institutional life of the church itself is healthy, that the problem is at the margins rather than at the center, that the higher engagement with the church would lead to more moral clarity rather than less. The data says otherwise. Pew Research has tracked the relationship between church attendance and Trump support among white evangelicals across multiple elections. What they found is consistent and uncomfortable. Among white evangelicals, those who attended church more frequently are more supportive of Trump, not less. In 2020, 85% of evangelical voters who attended church frequently voted for Trump, compared to 81% of those who attended less often. Robert Jones, founder of PRRI and author of White Too Long, examined this pattern in depth. His conclusion is stark. Among white evangelicals, Higher church attendance is positively correlated with core Trump impulses such as denials of structural racism, even when controlling for a range of other factors like education, gender, region, party affiliation. He adds, there's no evidence that higher church attendance has any mitigating effect on racist attitudes. If anything, the opposite is true. PRRI's research on Christian nationalism confirms the same pattern. Among Americans who attend religious service weekly or more, a majority, 52%, qualify as Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. Among those whom seldom or never attend, only 18% do. The most frequent churchgoers are nearly 3 times more likely to embrace an ideology that functions as anti-democratic. This matters because it removes the escape hatch. We cannot comfort ourselves with the belief that real Christianity is somehow separate from what's happening politically. The data suggests that the most institutionally committed white evangelicals, the ones showing up every Sunday, the ones in Bible studies and small groups, the one tithing and serving, they're the most captured, not the least. The church is not the antidote. For white evangelicals, it appears to be the incubator. Identity transformation. In Nazi Germany, ordinary citizens maintained their role as bystanders by retreating into private life, what some have called internal immigration. They continued shopping, working, raising families, going to church, while their neighbors were being deported. By compartmentalizing their lives, they convinced themselves they were powerless as long as their private world remained orderly. But something even more profound has happened in American evangelicalism. It's not just compartmentalization, it's fusion. Ryan Burge, a political scientist who's become one of the foremost analysts of American religious data, has documented this transformation using the General Social Survey and the Cooperative Election Study. He's tracked how white evangelicals position themselves ideologically relative to the 2 major parties. His finding? White evangelicals see no space between them and the Republican Party. Most religious groups, even conservative ones, see themselves as somewhere between the 2 parties ideologically. White evangelicals are the exception. They've come to view their own positions and the Republican Party's positions as essentially identical. The gap is closed completely. This represents something more than political alignment, it's identity fusion. What began as evangelicals who support Republicans has become something in which the religious and political identities are no longer separable. Burge puts it bluntly, the term evangelical is increasingly becoming associated with politics, particularly that of conservatism rather than its traditional association with adherence to evangelical theology. The label being claimed by people who rarely or never attend church, but who identify with the cultural and political tribe. In 2008, only 16% of self-identified evangelicals reported never or seldom attending church. By 2020, the number jumped to 27%. Among those non-attending evangelicals, the share identifying as politically conservative rose from about a third in 2008 to roughly half by 2019. People aren't even becoming evangelical because they've had a conversion experience or embrace evangelical theology. They're adopting the label because it signals membership in a political tribe. As Burge observes, instead of theological affinity for Jesus Christ, millions of Americans are being drawn into the evangelical label because of its association with the GOP. Oddly enough, this even includes members of other religious traditions. Not joking, in surveys, there are Muslim and Hindu evangelicals. The disappearance of the evangelical Democrat. To understand how complete this transformation has become, it helps to take a longer view. Before 1970, the white evangelical Democrats actually outnumbered the white evangelical Republicans. The evangelical world was politically diverse, not evenly split, but genuinely pluralistic. You could find evangelicals across the political spectrum, and partisan affiliation was not a predictor of theological conviction. That world is gone. By the 2020 election, Republicans made up 78% of white evangelicals. Democrats had shrunk to just 16. And the voting patterns are even more stark than identification numbers suggest. Regardless of how they identify, white evangelicals vote overwhelmingly Republican. In 2008, 80% for McCain. In 2012, 80% for Romney. In 2016, 2020, and 2024, roughly 80% or more voted for Trump. The evangelical Democrat has become, statistically speaking, an endangered species approaching extinction. And with that disappearance has come the loss of internal friction, internal debate, internal challenge, or just the presence of the other. Purge issued a warning of what this means. When a religious movement becomes overwhelmingly a political monoculture, that's not just bad for the people in the pews, but for democracy as a whole. We need to be around people who are different than us. And whatever church you're in, if everyone you sit next to on Sunday mornings votes the same way you do, then you're failing what it means to be a kingdom-centered church. He actually unpacks this in detail in his new book, The Vanishing Church. Just came out. Totally check it out. This is what sequential complicity produces over time. It doesn't just change individual positions. It sorts and purifies communities until dissent becomes unthinkable. Not because it's forbidden, but because there's really no one left to voice it. When the spell broke for me, I should tell you when I first felt the water getting hot. It wasn't 2016, it was 2001. Growing up as a church planter's kid, I hadn't been suspicious of the assumptions we made about what God's love looks like in public or politics. I could be found praying at the pole before school. During lunch, I ran a Bonhoeffer reading group. Yes, the irony is not lost on me now. I read Cost of Discipleship and Life Together with my classmates, never imagining that the community that had formed me was walking toward the very patterns Bonhoeffer warned against. Then came September 11th, and then came the church's response. When evangelicals leaders led the way to war in Iraq with rampant nationalism, militarism, and Islamophobia, I couldn't see how any of it made sense for followers of Jesus. If we learned we had enemies on 9/11, then we learned who we needed to pray for. Not kill, not bear false witness against, not demonize an entire religion to justify a war built on lies. Jesus had been fairly clear about enemies. Love them. Pray for those that persecute you. Do good to those who hate you. I memorized those verses in Sunday school, in the same rooms where I now heard justifications for shock and awe. It cost me friendships, it cost me vocational opportunities within evangelical institutions, but mostly it felt like a deep betrayal. How could the same community who introduced me to the love of God and Christ be so blind to the basic commands he gave his disciples? When did we decide the way, the truth, and the life was wrong about how to relate to our enemies? When did bearing false witness become acceptable if the target was a Muslim? When did we decide that the ends, security, victory, American dominance, justified means that Jesus had explicitly forbidden? I tell you this because I want you to understand I'm not writing from a place of superiority. I'm writing from a place of deep, deep grief. The tradition that gave me everything, my faith, my love of Scripture, my relationship with Jesus, was becoming something I barely recognize. And the transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened step by step, compromise by compromise, rationalization by rationalization. I saw it happening in 2003. Many didn't see it until 2016 or 2020 or January 6th. Some still don't see it. But the pattern here is the same. The water keeps warming, and we keep adjusting. Christianity today and the cost of dissent. When Christianity today, hardly a radical progressive outlet, published an editorial calling for Trump's removal. After the first impeachment, the backlash from evangelical leaders was immediate and furious. The magazine that Billy Graham had founded was accused of betraying the faith. Nearly 200 evangelical leaders signed a letter of rebuke. Think about what that reveals. The editorial hadn't questioned the authority of Scripture. It hadn't denied the resurrection or abandoned historic Christian doctrine. It had simply said that a president who had been impeached for abuse of power should be removed from office. And for that, it was treated as an enemy of the evangelical movement. The fusion was complete. The lock-in had happened. To question Trump was to question the faith community itself. Those who did dissent paid a price, just as moderates had paid a price during the SBC takeover in the 80s. Russell Moore, who had served as president of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, became a target of sustained attacks for his criticism of Trump and eventually left. David French, an evangelical writer and attorney, had been vilified by former allies for his opposition to Trump. Beth Moore, like everyone's mom's favorite video, Beth Moore, left the Southern Baptist Convention in 2021, citing this drift in the denomination. The pattern is consistent across decades. Dissent is possible, but it costs you your community. And for most people, that cost is simply too high. So they stay silent. They accommodate. They adjust. The social sorting that has already occurred makes future dissent even less likely. The evangelicals most troubled by the trajectory have disproportionately left, either leaving evangelicalism entirely or migrating to other traditions. Those who remain are increasingly those for whom the fusion feels natural rather than troubling. And then came January 6th. On the night of January 6th, 2021, I was in Edinburgh, Scotland, working on a postdoctoral fellowship at the university's divinity school. I stayed up late into the Scottish night watching the horror unfold at the Capitol. The mob storming the building, the gallows erected in the lawn, the Confederate flags in the rotunda, the zip ties, the tactical gear, the violence against police officers. And I watched the Jesus signs, Jesus Saves banners waving alongside QAnon flags, the dude in the horn headdress offering a prayer of thanks in the Senate chamber. The cross and the coup fused into a single image broadcast around the world. The next morning, in the Divinity School faculty lounge, I sat with other American Christian professors who shared my devastation. We talked about what we had witnessed, and we naively assumed, all of us, that this would finally break the spell Trump had over the white evangelical church. How could it not? This was a blatant betrayal of the faith. A violent attempt to overturn an election wrapped in Christian imagery and language. It was an undermining of the country's integrity. Surely, evangelical leaders who had made the bargain would now recognize what they'd enabled. Surely the fusion of Christian identity with political violence would be too obvious to ignore. Surely this was the line that couldn't be rationalized away. We were wrong. The same pattern played out in the GOP, played out in evangelical institutions as well. Do you remember how on January 7th, there were critics of Donald Trump who now are in his administration? They managed to start falling back in line, rewriting their own history, competing for his favor. Rationalization resumed. The ranks reformed. And Antifa, that's what did it. Oh, it was a false flag. That's what was going on. It was legitimate protests that got a smidgy out of hand. The real problem was the media coverage. The real victims were the patriots being persecuted for their presence that day. By that point, acknowledging what had happened on January 6th would have meant acknowledging what the whole trajectory had been leading toward. It would have meant admitting that the bargain had been a catastrophic mistake from the beginning. It would have meant facing not just a single bad decision, but decades of accumulated compromise. From the defense of segregated schools to the abandonment of Carter to the takeover of the SBC to the cheerleading for Iraq to every rationalization since. The psychological cost of that recognition was simply too high, so the accommodation continued. The rationalization deepened. The identity fusion held. I think sometimes about that morning in Edinburgh, about the colleagues who had shared my grief and my hope. We had assumed that seeing clearly would be enough. We'd assumed that the sheer weight of evidence would matter. We underestimated the power of sequential complicity. We underestimated how much had already been invested, how high the cost of reversal had become, how completely the identity fusion had taken hold. The water didn't just stay hot after January 6th. It got hotter still. The just world and the vanishing victims. There's another mechanism at work in sequential complicity that I find particularly haunting as a Christian. Just world thinking. In Nazi Germany, bystanders justified the exclusion and persecution of Jews by convincing them that the suffering was somehow deserved, or at least part of a larger order that made sense. Jewish suffering became, for many Christians, a mystery of God or even divine judgment, not a human crime demanding action. I see echoes of this in how many evangelicals have come to view the victims of the policies they support. Immigrants separated from children at the border? Well, they should have broken the law. Refugees fleeing from violence? Well, they should have come the right way. The poor without health care? They should have made better choices. The vulnerable swept up in mass deportations? They should have thought about the consequences. A mother killed by the state protesting ICE. She was a domestic terrorist. In each case, the suffering of real human beings, people made in the image of God, people Jesus called us to welcome and serve, that's reframed as the natural consequence of these sinners' failures. The just world remains intact. Our consciences remain clean. The victims become, in a strange but powerful psychological move, responsible for their own victimization. This is what happens when the universe of obligation contracts, when that circle of people toward whom we feel moral responsibility shrinks. When certain groups are defined as them rather than us, we can witness their suffering with what Bonhoeffer called abysmal indifference. They became not neighbors to be loved, but problems to be solved, threats to be contained, examples to be made of. The pattern has deep roots in white evangelical history. The same spirituality of the church doctrine that allowed white evangelicals to remain silent during the civil rights movement, the insistence that the church's business was souls, not society. It functions today to separate faith from responsibility for political harm. The theology of avoidance was practiced long before Trump. He simply gave it new applications. I watched it happen with Muslims after 9/11. I watched people I loved, people who had taught me to love my neighbor, dehumanize an entire religion to justify a war. The circle of moral obligation contracted, and those outside it became acceptable targets for violence, surveillance, discrimination. And the most troubling part, this contraction usually happens so gradually we don't notice it occurring. We simply don't wake up one morning and decide, I'm going to stop caring about immigrant children. We simply adjust. We accommodate the new normal. We let that temperature rise another degree. The sociological stupidity. Dietrich Bonhoeffer identified something during the Nazi years that I find more illuminating than almost anything else I've read on this subject. He called it stupidity, but he was careful to explain that he didn't mean intellectual deficiency. The stupidity Bonhoeffer described was not an intellectual defect, but a sociological one. It's what happened to human beings during strong pulses of political or religious power. Under certain conditions, people were deprived of their inner independence and became mindless tools under a spell of slogans and catchwords. Here's the part that haunts me. Bonhoeffer observed that people in this condition were capable of any evil, while simultaneously being incapable of recognizing that it was evil. Having surrendered their autonomous judgment to the movement, to the leader, to the tribe, they lost the capacity for independent moral reasoning. Facts that contradicted the narrative were dismissed. Concerns raised by outsiders only confirmed the persecution narrative. The very act of criticism became evidence of the critic's corruption. I don't know how to read that description without thinking about what I've witnessed in evangelical spaces over the past several years, and even more, the video Rorschach test that was Renee Good's death. The refusal to engage with factual corrections, the instant dismissal of any critical voice as liberal media or Trump derangement syndrome, the way every scandal, every indictment, every conviction only deepens loyalty rather than prompting reflection. This isn't intellectual failure. These are often intelligent, educated people. It's something else. Something that happens when identity becomes so fused with a movement that questioning the movement feels like annihilating the self. The turn toward a kind of spiritual warfare rhetoric has only intensified this dynamic. When political opponents are identified, not merely as wrong, but as demonic forces to be vanquished, the possibility of self-examination disappears entirely. You can't compromise with Satan. You can only admit that those fighting Satan or protesting a policy might have a point. The framing forecloses reflection by design. PRRI's data on Christian nationalism confirms this pattern. Among Christian nationalism adherents and sympathizers, support for Trump approaches near unanimity. At the state level, support for Christian nationalism is nearly perfectly correlated with votes for Trump. The ideology and the candidate have become inseparable, two expressions of the same identity. Bonhoeffer said the only remedy for this kind of stupidity was an act of liberation, not instruction. You couldn't argue people out of it. You could only love them and wait and pray for something to break the spell. I think about those lunch hour Bonhoeffer reading groups sometimes from high school. I think about how he underlined pages about costly grace and the dangers of cheap grace. I think about how confident we were that we understood what he was warning against. And I think about how the very community that encouraged me to read Bonhoeffer was walking, step by step, into the patterns he described. We read about the German church and thought, how could they not see it? Now I understand. They couldn't see it because each step seemed small, because each compromise had a reasonable justification, because the people around them were making the same compromises, because the cost of seeing clearly was the loss of everything familiar. They couldn't see it for the same reasons we can't. What the neutral middle gets wrong. One more insight from the German church that I think speaks directly to our moment. Bonhoeffer identified the real enemy of faithful resistance not as the obvious extremists, but as those in the middle. The neutral, moderate officials who believed they could hold things together through compromise and reasonable accommodation. These leaders outmaneuvered the radicals, but were willing to make deals with the regime to avoid conflict. They were the responsible people who failed because they naively believed they could patch up a structure that had come out of joint through mere reason or compromise. By trying to do justice to all sides, they were eventually crushed by the clashing forces of evil, for falling victim to the stronger party while achieving nothing. I think about this when I encounter the principled middle in contemporary evangelicalism, leaders who privately explain dismay but publicly stay silent, who offer gentle corrections but refuse to name what is happening clearly, who hope that by maintaining relationships and avoiding confrontation, they can somehow moderate the extremes. I understand the impulse. I've felt it myself. The desire to hold things together, to not burn bridges, to believe that patient presence will accomplish more than prophetic confrontation. But in situations of escalating complicity, the neutral middle doesn't moderate the extremes. It provides cover for them. It legitimizes the trajectory by refusing to name it. It allows the temperature to keep rising while counseling patience and calm. The confessing church in Germany learned this too late. It began with bold theological stands, the Barmen Declaration, but was eventually undermined by moderate officials who prioritized institutional preservation over moral witness. When the regime offered neutral committees and paths to legalization, many leaders took them, shattering the movement's unity. By 1938, when clergy were ordered to swear a personal oath of loyalty to Hitler, the overwhelming majority complied, including most confessing church pastors. At a certain point, neutrality becomes its own form of complicity. The moderate position becomes the enabler of radical outcomes. Breaking the sequence. So where does this leave us? Is the pattern inevitable? Once a community starts down the path of sequential compromise, is there any way back? The historical record offers one crucial piece of hope. La Charbon-sur-Lignon. During the Nazi occupation in France, this small village in the mountains became a center of rescue. Led by Pastor André Tromme and his wife Magda, the community saved thousands of Jewish refugees, mostly children. They hid them in their homes, forged documents, guided them to safety across the Swiss border. What made Chambon different? Several factors. A pastor who preached what he called an ethic of combat rather than comfortable accommodation. A community with a historical memory of persecution. The villagers, largely Protestant in Catholic France, and shared a conviction that obedience to God superseded obedience to the state. But perhaps, most importantly, Chambon refused the first step. When the Vichy government ordered a census of Jews in the village, the pastor told his congregation to refuse. When officials came to search for refugees, villagers hid them. The community never entered the new psychological situation of initial compliance because they never complied to begin with. This suggests something important for the moment. For those who've already taken steps down the path of complicity, the way forward isn't simply to stop where they are. It requires something more costly. Acknowledging the previous steps were wrong, accepting the loss of the investment we've already made, and finding communities that can sustain the social cost of reversal. And for those who haven't yet been captured, for younger evangelicals or Christians in other traditions, or anyone who still has the capacity for independent moral judgment, the lesson's equally clear. Don't take the first step. Pay attention to the small compromises, the reasonable seeming accommodations, the binary choices that foreclose moral complexity. The sequence starts somewhere. A word to my evangelical friends. I want to end by speaking directly to those of you still inside the world, those who recognize something true in what I've written, but who also feel defensive, angry, perhaps hurt. I understand. I know what it's like to have your faith community questioned, to feel like outsiders are attacking something precious to you, to suspect the critiques like this one are really just partisan politics dressed up in theological language. I'm not asking you to become a Democrat. I'm not asking you to abandon your convictions about abortion or religious liberty or any of the other issues that have shaped evangelical political engagement for decades, I'm asking for something simpler and harder. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that the sequence has carried you somewhere you never intended to go. That the bargain has cost more than you realized. That the water has gotten hotter than you've allowed yourself to feel. Consider the evidence. In 2011, white evangelicals were the religious group least likely to believe that personal immorality was compatible with public leadership, and today the most. Before 1970, white evangelical Democrats outnumbered Republicans. Today, 78% identify as Republican, and the evangelical Democrats all but vanished. The term evangelical itself is becoming untethered from theology and attached to the political tribe. These are not small shifts. They represent fundamental transformation of what it means to be evangelical in America. And the transformation has happened so gradually, so incrementally, that many inside the community haven't recognized how far they've traveled. I'm asking you to consider that the way back, while painful, is still possible. Some people, like the people who eventually broke free from complicity in Nazi Germany, almost always did so through relationship. Someone they trusted asked them an honest question. Someone they loved showed them what they had stopped seeing. A human connection broke through the ideological fog. I don't think arguments will save us, but I think love might. I think friendship might. I think honest conversations between people who trust each other might. I still read the Bible every night. I still talk to Jesus before I sleep. That same practice I learned as a child in those Baptist churches. The practice that has never wavered, even if much else fell away. The Jesus I met in those pages is still the one who told us to love our enemy, to welcome the stranger, to care for the least of these, to refuse the way of violence and domination. That Jesus is why I can't be silent, and that Jesus is why I still have hope. Because the gospel has always been about confession, about naming what we've done and who we've become, about accepting grace that we cannot earn, about the possibility of transformation that doesn't depend on our ability to save ourselves. The sequence can be broken. The kettle can be escaped, but only if we're willing to feel the heat and acknowledge how hot it's become. The frogs in the kettle, I said at the beginning, aren't actually passive. As the illustration suggests, real frogs jump out when things get dangerous. Maybe we can be more like real frogs. Maybe it's not too late.